Hi, Zizaran here with another video, and today I want to talk to you about itemization. So, we've now played over 100 hours of Diablo 4 already. We got the world first push to level 100 on hardcore. I was wrong. I wanted to talk a little about that, and I'm very excited to be wrong because when first especially playing the level 25 demos and seeing all the gear in Diablo 4, that was one of my biggest concerns. I thought the gear was basically green up arrow equals more better, and I was wrong. I'm very pleasantly surprised by the itemization system in Diablo 4, and you know what? I thought it was going to be absolutely dog shit. Even though it is very, very basic in a way, it's surprisingly enjoyable. So they actually didn't do too bad here. Now, there are obviously a lot of things you can improve upon, especially having more unique items, but yeah, I wanted to make a video talking about the fact that I was wrong and what I do like about the system. So we'll talk a little bit about my specific gear pieces and stuff like that. Well, one thing that I thought was very odd was, well, the main stats don't really do anything. Well, they do at the end game, and that's something I said in my video initially was, well, it probably will be impactful at the end game. It isn't early. Now, Wolsten actually has a similar system, but the int stats and stuff like that scale based on your level. I actually think Diablo 4 could benefit from something like that. We're getting, 30 int at level 20 or level 30 would actually be a huge increase. And while it is actually an impactful endgame increase, endgame you might want 70 or 80 int for it to have a similar effect. I actually think that's pretty good because that makes that stats are always a relevant and exciting stat to get throughout the game. So having some sort of scaling on that could be pretty beneficial. I was actually trying to stack int here, so whenever I was able to get pieces with like 80 int, etc., which I think I have on something, at least I have 63 int here, and I was looking for that. Like, that was an actual good thing for me to get. And there are obviously like groups of stats that can happen on items, and it does have basically item levels similar to Path of Exile. For example, item power, I can't remember exactly what it goes up to, but it goes up to something like 880, or it's close to 900, I think. And I think the highest I have is 813. Now, this is similar to item level in Path of Exile. And if you're wondering what exactly is similar, 720 item power is the same as item level 86, basically, in Path of Exile. Because that means that there are thresholds. Let's say that the max possible cooldown on a helmet is 19% fully upgraded. That would actually be available already at 720, and you just need to be lucky. There's not a huge benefit of item power past 720. It basically upgrades the armor, which is important, and it upgrades the damage per second, which is also important. So item power is the most important on your weapon. It is still important on your gear because armor is a very big source of mitigation, but it is imperative that you do get 720 plus. And that's because, similar to Path of Exile having tiers, like let's say that I don't have a spreadsheet open with all the stats right now, but let's say that 20 cooldown reduction, that you can actually roll at 720. A lot of items have their own stats, right? Like I can't get cooldown reduction on my chest, I can't get it on my gloves, and at some point, I think this happened for me between like level 60 and level 80, where I started realizing what stats I really needed to look out for on what pieces of gear. Like, not every piece of gear can have plus level of ice shards, right? Or plus level of, for example, your mastery skills, your defensive skills, or your core skills. So for example, here we have +2 ranks of all mastery skills, and you can't get that on every piece. So at some point, you start getting used to the fact that, well, I can get Ice Nova, Ice Armor, and Teleport on my boots. I can get mana cost reduction, and you sort of make like a rough list of maybe 6 stats that you want per item, and you start looking for an item that actually has 4 out of the 6 stats that you want. For example, very, very important for me to get cooldown reduction on my offhand, but I also really want high damage per second. So I was looking for lucky hit chance, crit chance, intelligence. Crowd control duration isn't bad, but I mostly was happy with this because it was 1200 damage per second. And you can upgrade or change one stat. For example, on this one, I think it's the intelligence I'm rerolling. You can see that it's marked in blue, and I could reroll this and eventually get either a higher tier of intelligence or a different stat that I would rather have. Another thing worth mentioning is a lot of people thought that you could reroll the stats within the tier because they noticed they were changing when they were upgrading. A lot of people that thought this was similar to Divines in Path of Exile It is not. You can see currently that the damage to injured enemies on my Ice Heart Brace is maxed. It's 32.5. That means that on the preview now, it is going to be maxed here as well. So it stays at the same percentage within the tier, but that gets upgraded. So if I pay another there, now this has the potential to now become 37.5. So that's kind of how that works. It stays at the same level within the tier, but it will upgrade it. So if something maybe started at level 1 with 200 maximum life, at level 5 it'll have up to 450, and if this was a higher roll, it would be 575. We don't have a way to like alter these rolls right now, so that means that you are actually chasing items and looking for upgrades for a long time, because you have multiple tiers, like you have tier 1 life, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, etc., and then you have rolls within those. Now, you also have different levels of items. You have ancestral, sacred, and rare items. Let's see, I don't know if I still have any normal items, or if oh, here I have a sacred item. It's basically sort of like tiers of item power. Like, you'll quickly notice that, you know, if this was just normal rare boots, that'd probably be like 500 item power. Sacred seems to be up to like 720-ish, 730, and then ancestral are more like closer to 800. For uniques, this wasn't that important unless it's a weapon. So for example, here I have an ancestral unique staff. You see that this is very important because this affects the damage per second. So I'm very happy that I found a Staff of Endless Rage at ancestral with a high damage per second. However, if you're finding, for example, well, Ice Heart Brace, these are sacred, they don't have the high item power. The only thing I'm missing out on then is the armor, which isn't the end of the world. And it means that, for example, if you found a Shako as a normal unique, that would still be completely OP. So that is worth keeping in mind. The name itself, like sacred, ancestral, etc., isn't really that important. It's just about the item power and the actual stats on the items. Let's talk a little bit about unique items. They're a little hard to see in my stash, but I did get quite a few cool ones. I ended up using Raiment of the Infinite. We got, thankfully, both of us got that. And it basically, after using teleport, close enemies are pulled to you and stunned. And the teleport cooldown is increased. Now, we both had that, so that was really, really nice because we stun a bunch of enemies and we'll just like suck them all together, and that makes it a lot easier to AoE them down. I was using Ice Heart Brace a little bit as well. They're not that great. When we were pushing in a group, I wasn't using them, but for solo, they were nice. Izu's Heirloom. I actually have a max roll pair of these somewhere, and I think I will be using those at some point on a different Sork because it can give you a large amount of crit chance. I got a item called a Razor Plate, which could be really, really cool. I kind of want to make a Thorns Barb for PvP, which I just focus on tanking, and people end up killing themselves on me. I think that would be really, really cool, especially against fast attacking things like a Rogue or a Sork. And a Sork, if we can get it right, might just one-tap themselves on us. And I think that would be really, really cool. Now, I actually really, really like unique items in the game. And I really wish there were more of them, like quite a lot more, where you end up having a choice of having 2 to 3 build enabling uniques because you don't want too many. They do end up lacking a lot of the stats that rare items and legendary items have. And I really like that. I like that it hopefully won't be the case that you'll just deck out your character in uniques, even if you end up getting more uniques in the game, and that you will still have like maybe 2 or 3 build enabling uniques, and then you're focusing on legendary gear. I am very worried about set items. I really hope they don't make it into the game, full stop. I hope Blizzard realize what a dangerous thing set items are, because in my opinion, that's what ruined Diablo 3 for me. The fact that you finish your season journey and it's like, here's a set that makes your skill do 10,000 million% more damage, and every other skill is pointless now. I do think there are ways to make set items good and usable, but they end up becoming either completely useless or completely overpowered, and I haven't really seen many games do anything in between. So legendaries are a very, very important part of Diablo 4, and you can obviously extract legendary aspects and then they'll appear here. You can now put them in any item. Now, obviously I have already put things in these, and important to know that you can still put new ones. A lot of people don't realize that you can keep putting aspects. So if I want to change my mind and I don't want this anymore, I could put this in, and then maybe I change my mind again and I will put another one in. The only thing you can't do is you can't extract out of one that has been put in, right? So you can only extract from legendaries that you're actually finding. You do also have aspects as well from the Codex of Power. So there are loads of different ones, even loads from my class. These will appear always at the lowest level. So it actually ends up becoming really, really important to find good rolls, even of the ones you get from dungeon. A good example is this: using a cooldown restores 15 to 25 mana. Getting 25 would be huge here for me. I actually never found one. So there is actually a very, very large benefit if you find a max roll one pretty early. You really want to save it for later until you're like really found a good item that you're unlikely to replace. So I was very, very careful with like not using any like max rolled ones. And these change your builds massively. Here, the Avalanche Key passive now applies to one additional cast, which is this endgame thing here. Your Frost heals have up to a 10% chance to make your next cast of Ice Shards consume no mana and deal 40% increased damage, and the chance is doubled against vulnerable enemies. So this is obviously very powerful, and there's other things that were really good, like for example, this armor thing here takes my armor mitigation, which is currently 33%. I believe it made it 80 or 90. So obviously very, very strong for hardcore, huge armor mitigation there. And then also we have the mana reduction, the Ice Shard Pierce, and the more damage versus immobilized or stunned enemies. So very, very many good things here that will be very build enabling. I'm working on a rogue right now, and there's several legendaries I'm looking out for. You can't use these until level 25 from the aspects. Now, one thing that's interesting is resists is kind of a dead stat. I know Crep has talked about this a lot, but armor, seeing as it works on all damage, its non-physical damage taken is reduced according to your armor contribution. It's half the mitigation, I believe. So if you have 90% physical mitigation, you have 45% all mitigation. And if we go look at my resistances here, so 52% cold resist reduces incoming cold damage by 26%. You sort of just get this pretty generically. It's a stat I never ever focused on gear. And yeah, it's not very important, especially combined and compared to things like damage reduction from elites, from vulnerable enemies, burning enemies, close enemies, nearby enemies, whatever you want to call it. Those were a lot more important and what we ended up focusing on, as well as just stacking a large amount of life, currently sitting on 12,000 life. And that was a lot more important. For offensive stats, I was focusing on getting int, damage to frozen enemies, damage to stunned enemies, nearby enemies, or sorry, close enemies, crit chance, a lucky strike, etc. Cooldown was huge for the way we were playing because we were trying to do Frost Nova and teleport as much as absolutely possible. I actually didn't end up getting a high level Frost Nova. I think you can get to like 15 or 20, which would make the cooldown very, very low. Especially because Frost Nova loses 1 cooldown second per enemy killed up to 4 seconds. So if you get it to 8, you have a 4-second cooldown. Now, Diablo 4 is fairly limited crafting, but it works like this. So let's say I have this helmet here and I don't use Lightning Spear. So now I can pay, the important thing here is a Forgotten Soul and 137,000 gold. I now get 7.5 more crowd control duration or 20 mana, and 20 mana is pretty substantial. If I now replace this affix, boom. Now, next up, you can see that it still costs the same materials here, but the gold cost is now increased, so this ends up being a pretty crazy gold sink. If I now do this again, it's always replacing the 20 mana. It's now highlighted in blue. I can no longer interact with the other stats. Boom. I can now get willpower, armor. Although the 20 mana is a pretty big deal. It is like 20% more mana. So I'm pretty happy with that, even though the armor would be very good as well. That being said, I do hope Diablo 4 ends up getting some sort of crafting system at one point. I don't want games to be too similar, but a system I wish was in every single game would be Path of Exile's Val Orb. It's basically you risk the item and it either destroys the item, does nothing, or has a huge chance of giving a small buff to the item. And I really love the whole like risk reward thing, especially on unique items. And it ends up being just a very, very cool function that I'm such a huge fan of. And I think every game should have that risk reward as sort of a final outcome to an item if you are bold enough to use it. Here, for example, is another craft. So this is actually a really good amulet. It could be an upgrade for me. It's got +1 defensive skills, decently high cooldown reduction, which I think will be higher than my current one once I get it up to level 5. +2 ranks of glass cannon, which is a lot of damage. So more damage taken. But this strength here is not very good. Thorns. None of these are any good. So I would just replace, and it doesn't really matter if I replace or not. Try again. Shock skill damage, control impairment, duration reduction. I mean, yeah. I'm not getting very lucky here. I do want to be a little bit careful because The souls are actually very, very hard for me to get at the moment since I am level 100, and the elites are pretty hard to kill because they keep scaling with you. You do also get a lot of power from the gems. You can see I'm getting a large amount of life from these here. That is why I have 12,000. And then we have things like critical strike damage on vulnerable enemies. So definitely worth doing the gems, particularly armor in the jewels. Remember what the other ones do. It's just resist. So armor is by far the strongest one, seeing as that affects all the damage you take. So that being said, I think items were a lot better than I initially thought they were going to be because the system is obviously a lot more simple than Path of Exile, but it is refreshingly simple. And while it is not as complex, it is still pretty entertaining and fun to find items in the game, and you're always looking for upgrades, and it's actually quite hard to find upgrades because you basically need to find an item with 3 perfect stats and then reroll the 4th. I do hope Diablo 4 ends up getting a robust crafting system with its seasons, but for now, pretty happy with this, and I'm looking for more upgrades. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, but more importantly, try to die less than I do.